The story begins in a quiet town where whispers often carried louder than truth. In 1912, the Harrington family was known for its wealth, power, and reputation. Their sprawling estate stood as a symbol of stability in an otherwise modest community. Yet beneath the chandeliers and manicured gardens, a secret was forming that would not only tear the family apart, but also echo for generations. Catherine Harrington, the lady of the house, was admired for her grace and beauty. To the outside world, she was the perfect wife to Edward Harrington, a stern but respected businessman. Together they seemed the portrait of elegance and order. But those who looked closer noticed cracks, late-night arguments behind closed doors, Catherine's increasingly long absences, and Edward's growing paranoia. And then came the child. Born in the summer of 1913, young Thomas Harrington was celebrated as the family heir. The townspeople gathered to see him, commenting on how strikingly handsome he was for a newborn, with dark eyes that seemed older than their years. But behind polite smiles, whispers grew louder, for the child bore features that didn't quite belong to Edward: a sharper jawline, darker complexion, and an uncanny resemblance to another man in town, Edward's own brother, Richard. Richard Harrington was everything Edward was not. Where Edward was rigid and disciplined, Richard was charming and reckless. A soldier freshly returned from his posting abroad, Richard carried with him a reputation of indulgence. Women, drink, and trouble seemed to follow wherever he went, but he was also magnetic, the kind of man people couldn't resist, even when they knew they should. And so, a scandal began to fester. Could Thomas be the child of both men, one by name and one by blood? The child of two fathers, a hidden paternity scandal. The Harrington estate, with its ivy-wrapped walls and whispering oak trees, always seemed like a place where time stood still. But in the years following Thomas's birth, time didn't bring peace. Instead, it unraveled like a tightly wound rope, one fraying strand after another. Inside the grand house, Catherine Harrington lived in a constant state of quiet dread. Every time she looked at her son, she felt two emotions battling in her heart: love and fear. Love because Thomas was hers, the only light in her increasingly dark existence. Fear because his face reminded her of Richard, not Edward. And Edward had noticed. Edward was not the sort of man who expressed doubt openly. He was cold, calculative, and prided himself on keeping emotions buried deep beneath the surface. Yet when he looked at the boy, his jaw tightened, and his gaze lingered too long. At dinner, he studied Thomas's eyes as if they were pieces of evidence in a courtroom. At times, Catherine swore she could hear him grinding his teeth. The townspeople, too, began to whisper. Servants, who often saw what their masters tried to hide, carried tales to taverns and markets. They spoke of Richard's visits to the Harrington home, sometimes when Edward was away on business. They spoke of Catherine's walks through the gardens, where she and Richard were once seen standing too close, voices lowered, shoulders brushing in ways that could not be mistaken for innocence. It was said that in the year before Thomas was born, Catherine had suffered a kind of illness, a fainting spell that left her bedridden for days. During that time, Richard had been the one to bring her medicine, flowers, and company. The servants remembered his charm, his laughter echoing down the halls, Catherine's smile brighter than it had been in years. Now when they looked at the child with the Harrington name but Richard's unmistakable features, the truth seemed too obvious to ignore. But no one dared confront the family directly. The Harringtons were powerful. Their name built schools, funded the church, and paid wages for half the town. To accuse them of scandal was to risk ruin. Yet silence is not the same as peace. By the winter of 1915, the tension between Edward and Richard had grown unbearable. Richard had returned from war with more than just medals. He carried a kind of swagger that infuriated his elder brother. He drank in the company of strangers, gambled recklessly, and often returned to the estate with mud on his boots and perfume clinging to his uniform. Edward despised him. To Edward, Richard represented everything corrosive: chaos, disobedience, temptation. But what Edward despised most was that Catherine's eyes often followed Richard. She tried to hide it, but Edward noticed. He always noticed. At Christmas that year, the Harringtons held a grand gathering at the estate, as they did every year. The dining hall glittered with candlelight, tables heavy with food, and the townsfolk invited as guests to honor the family's supposed generosity. Catherine wore a sapphire gown, her hair pinned high, her smile as polished as her pearls. Edward stood beside her, a stiff figure in black, while Richard strolled in late, laughter spilling from him like wine. But the moment that sealed the night in memory was not the feast, nor the music. It was when Thomas, now 2 years old, toddled into the room, and upon seeing Richard, cried out a single word: "Father." The room froze. Catherine's hand tightened around her wineglass until it nearly cracked. Edward's face drained of color, and for a moment, the silence was so sharp it seemed the chandeliers themselves might shatter. Richard, ever reckless, only smiled, a half-smirk that could be read as amusement, or something far more dangerous. The child was ushered away quickly, servants scrambling to cover the moment with nervous laughter, but the damage had been done. Every guest left the estate that night with the same thought heavy on their tongue. The boy had spoken the truth. From that night onward, Edward's suspicion became obsession. He began keeping meticulous records of Thomas's features. He would sketch the boy's face in his ledger, noting the slope of his nose, the shape of his brow, the color of his hair. He compared these notes to portraits of himself at the same age, and then to photographs of Richard. The resemblance was undeniable. Catherine begged him to stop, insisting that jealousy had poisoned his mind, but Edward would not relent. At night, Catherine sometimes awoke to find him standing over the child's crib, staring down as though studying a stranger. His breathing slow, his eyes dark. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to revel in the chaos. He made no attempt to distance himself from the boy. Instead, he often went out of his way to spend time with Thomas. He taught him how to whistle, lifted him onto his shoulders, and carved him wooden toys with his soldier's knife. When asked why, Richard would laugh and say, "Every boy deserves an uncle who cares for him like a father." The words cut Edward like a blade. By the spring of 1916, the Harrington estate had become a battlefield. Though no one raised a weapon, it was a war of glances, whispers, and quiet cruelties. Catherine was caught in the middle, her heart torn in ways she could never confess aloud. She had loved Edward once, in her youth, but marriage had hardened him into stone. Richard, by contrast, had been warmth and freedom, the only man who had ever made her laugh with abandon. The child was living proof of a choice she had made in secret, and a choice she could never undo. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal that tragedy struck. One evening, as a storm battered the estate, Thomas vanished. The boy had been playing in the nursery while Catherine prepared him for bed. She left the room briefly to fetch a blanket, and when she returned, the crib was empty. Panic swept through the household. Servants rushed through the halls, calling his name, lanterns flickering in their hands. The storm outside made the search treacherous. Rain slashed against the windows, thunder rattled the glass, and the gardens had become a mire of mud and shadows. At last, the boy was found, shivering at the edge of the woods that bordered the estate. He was unharmed, save for a scrape on his knee, but he clutched something in his tiny hands, a pocket watch, engraved with the initials RH. When asked where he had found it, Thomas simply said, "Father gave it to me." Richard, of course, denied it. He claimed the boy must have stumbled across the watch in his room, that he had misplaced it earlier that week. But Catherine saw the look in Edward's eyes, a look that promised there would be no forgiveness. In the days that followed, Edward's obsession became a mission. He began investigating ways to prove paternity, a near impossible task in an era before modern DNA testing. He consulted doctors, read obscure medical journals, and even spoke with a traveling lecturer who claimed to know methods of blood comparison. Though the science was crude and unreliable, Edward seized upon it as his salvation. He became convinced he could prove once and for all that Thomas was not his son. Catherine, desperate to protect both her child and her secret, pleaded with Richard to leave the estate, to return to the city or join his regiment once more. But Richard only laughed. "If Edward wants a war," he told her one night in the garden, "then let him have it. But you and I know the truth, Catherine, and so does Thomas." Her heart ached, for she knew Richard was right. The child's eyes told a story no doctor or journal could erase. And yet the truth was also a curse, one that threatened to destroy them all. The scandal of the Harrington family was no longer confined to whispers. It had become a storm, brewing louder with every passing day. The child at the center of it all was too young to understand, too innocent to know the chaos his existence had sparked. But others understood all too well. Edward was a man betrayed, humiliated in his own home. Richard was a man who thrived on fire, daring the flames to consume him. And Catherine was a woman caught between two men, both of whom had laid claim to the same son. The stage was set for tragedy, though none yet knew how deeply it would cut, because secrets once whispered always demand a reckoning, and in the case of the child with two fathers, that reckoning was only beginning. The Harrington estate was no longer a home. It had become a prison lined with velvet curtains and marble floors. Every corner carried tension, every glance cut deeper than words. And at the center of this silent war was a child too young to understand the storm he had been born into. By 1917, Thomas Harrington was nearly 4 years old enough to talk in full sentences, old enough to run through the corridors laughing, but still innocent enough not to recognize the shadows that followed his every step. To him, the world was divided between three figures: the stern man who called himself father, the warm man who called himself uncle, and the woman whose eyes filled with both love and dread each time she looked at him. But for Edward Harrington, there was no such innocence. His obsession had reached a fever pitch. He kept a locked drawer in his study, filled with notes about the boy's features, scraps of hair collected from Thomas's brush,
even tiny swabs of blood he had pricked from the child's finger when no one was watching. Edward labeled everything meticulously, convinced that one day science would vindicate him. His ledger read like a diary of madness. The child's jawline, more prominent than mine, resembles Richard's strongly. Darkness of hair inconsistent with my family line. Eyes, shape identical to Richard's portrait at age 4. Catherine discovered the ledger one evening when Edward had left his study unlocked. The sight of her son's life reduced to measurements and comparisons filled her with horror. She burned to confront Edward, but she dared not, for fear of what he might do if she admitted even a sliver of the truth. Instead, she returned the ledger to its drawer and locked it once more, her hands trembling. Edward was losing himself to suspicion, but Richard, ever the provocateur, seemed to feed on it. He visited the estate frequently, claiming it was his duty as family. He played with Thomas in the gardens, lifting him onto the branches of the great oak, teaching him to balance, to laugh, to climb higher than Catherine dared watch. He brought the boy small gifts from town, a carved soldier, a toy drum, a leather-bound book of stories. And each time Thomas ran to Richard with open arms, Edward's fury grew darker. The townspeople, too, had taken notice. The Christmas incident when Thomas had called Richard father had become legend, retold in hushed voices over tavern counters and behind church pews. The Harrington wealth kept tongues from wagging too loudly, but suspicion was everywhere. Mothers warned their daughters to avoid the estate. Shopkeepers spoke of Edward's drawn face, of Catherine's haunted beauty, of Richard's dangerous charm. Some whispered that the boy was cursed, that his very birth had invited ruin. Others, more superstitious still, claimed that when two men lay claim to the same child, no good could ever follow. In the Harrington home, these whispers took form as nightmares. Catherine began waking in the night to the sound of footsteps outside her chamber door. She swore she saw shadows lingering in the hallway, though when she opened the door, no one was there. Once, she found Thomas standing by the window at dawn, staring into the garden as though waiting for someone. When she asked what he was doing, he replied simply, "Father said he'd come for me." When she pressed him, Thomas would not say which father he meant. The breaking point came in the summer of 1917. Edward, determined to expose Richard once and for all, invited a physician from the city to examine the boy. The physician, Dr. Alistair Graves, was known for his interest in experimental methods of heredity testing, crude, unproven techniques that most in the medical community dismissed as pseudoscience. But Edward clung to him like a drowning man to driftwood. Catherine protested fiercely. She argued that such an examination was unnecessary, even dangerous, but Edward would not be swayed. Richard, on the other hand, laughed when he heard the news. "Let Edward play his games," he said. "The truth cannot be hidden forever." The examination was conducted in the drawing room of the estate, with the curtains drawn tight. Dr. Graves studied Thomas carefully, taking notes on his features, his blood type, and even the patterns of his fingerprints. He compared them to samples taken from both Edward and Richard. After hours of study, Dr. Graves delivered his verdict. Inconclusive. The methods available could not prove paternity with certainty. There were similarities to both men, though the resemblance to Richard was, in the doctor's own words, striking. Edward was enraged. He accused Richard of bribing the doctor, of tampering with the results. Richard only smiled, his calmness infuriating his brother further. Catherine, meanwhile, sat trembling in her chair, knowing that every word brought them closer to the truth she could never admit. Thomas, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, simply asked if he could go play outside. That night the estate erupted in violence. Edward confronted Catherine in their chamber, demanding she confess. His voice thundered, his hands shook, and for the first time in their marriage, Catherine saw fear in his eyes, not fear of losing her, but fear of humiliation, of betrayal too public to conceal. "Tell me," Edward hissed, his face inches from hers. "Tell me whose child he is." Catherine stood silent, her lips pressed tight, her body trembling. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but she knew the truth would destroy them all. Her silence was answer enough. Edward struck her across the face, the blow sending her tumbling to the floor. For a moment, he loomed over her, his hand raised again, but something in him faltered. Instead, he turned and stormed from the room, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled in its panes. Catherine lay in the silence, tears streaking her face, her heart pounding. She knew then that the secret could not hold forever, and she feared what Edward might do when the dam finally broke. In the weeks that followed, Edward's behavior grew erratic. He avoided the company of others, spending long hours locked in his study, emerging with bloodshot eyes and shaking hands. He drank heavily, though he had once despised Richard for the same habit. His once meticulous suits grew wrinkled, his shoes unpolished, his hair unkempt. The master of the Harrington estate was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Richard, by contrast, seemed only to grow stronger. He took to visiting Catherine more often, sometimes in secret, sometimes boldly. Their encounters were fraught with danger, for Catherine knew Edward's suspicion burned hotter than ever, yet she found herself unable to resist. Richard was her one refuge, her one reminder of warmth and passion in a house turned cold. It was during one of these secret meetings, in the garden at dusk, that Richard made his boldest claim yet. "Leave him," he whispered, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Take Thomas, and come with me. Edward has lost his mind. He will ruin us all. But with me you will be free." Catherine's heart ached with longing, but fear held her back. Edward's power was vast. His influence stretched across the county. To leave him would mean exile, poverty, perhaps even death. She shook her head, tears in her eyes, and pulled her hand from Richard's grasp. Richard's face hardened, and for the first time Catherine saw something dangerous in him. Not charm, but desperation. By autumn, the scandal could no longer be contained within the walls of the estate. Servants began to leave, unable to endure the constant tension. Rumors spread more boldly now, reaching even the ears of Edward's business partners. Deals began to falter, contracts were withdrawn, and whispers of illegitimacy threatened the Harrington legacy. Edward, cornered and humiliated, devised a plan. He would send Richard away permanently. He called upon his contacts in the military, arranging for Richard to be reassigned to a distant regiment overseas. When Richard learned of the plan, his fury knew no bounds. He confronted Edward in the great hall, their voices echoing off the marble walls. Catherine, standing at the top of the staircase, heard every word. "You cannot erase me," Richard spat. "Not from this house, not from Catherine, and not from Thomas. He is mine, Edward. You know it. The whole world knows it." Edward's face twisted with rage. "You will rot before I let you steal what is mine." Their shouting match ended with servants dragging Richard from the hall, his laughter echoing like a curse. "You cannot hide the truth, brother," he called. "It will destroy you." Catherine clutched the banister, her heart racing. She knew Richard was right. The truth could not be buried, and when it surfaced, it would consume them all. But the true horror was yet to come, for in the winter of 1917, just as the snow began to fall over the Harrington estate, tragedy struck again. One night, Thomas vanished from his bed for the second time. This time, he did not return by dawn. Lanterns flickered through the woods. Dogs were sent to track his scent. Servants scoured every inch of the grounds. Catherine collapsed in hysteria, while Edward barked orders with a desperation that betrayed his terror. And then, at last, the boy was found, not at the edge of the woods but in the stables. He was curled beneath a horse blanket, fast asleep, clutching a small wooden soldier carved by Richard's hand. When Edward saw it, something in him snapped. He ripped the toy from Thomas's grasp and hurled it into the fire. Then he turned to Catherine, his face pale, his voice trembling. "This ends," he whispered. "One way or another, this ends." Catherine stared at him, her blood running cold, for she knew what Edward meant, and she feared the reckoning had finally arrived. The winter of 1917 pressed itself upon the Harrington estate like a suffocating hand. The snow piled thick against the walls, the trees stood like black sentinels in the frozen landscape, and the wind carried a shrillness that seemed less like weather, and more like a warning. Within those walls, the Harrington family rotted from within. Thomas, now 4.5, had become restless, confused by the constant strain in his household. His days were filled with lessons from tutors, who tried to maintain normalcy, but even he could sense that something was wrong. He asked questions Catherine could not answer. "Why does father look at me that way? Why does Uncle Richard always smile when father shouts? Why do you cry when you think I'm asleep?" Catherine would only hold him tighter, whispering lullabies through trembling lips. But no lullaby could silence the truth that hovered over them all. Edward Harrington had once been a man of precision, his ledgers neat, his suits immaculate, his manner cool and composed. But by the early months of 1918, he was a ghost of himself. He no longer dined with the family, choosing instead to take meals in his study. Servants reported the smell of whiskey seeping beneath the door at all hours. At times he could be heard muttering to himself, pacing back and forth, the floor creaking beneath his measured steps. One maid swore she heard him addressing unseen company. "Whose son is he?" Edward whispered again and again, as though asking the walls to answer. Sometimes his voice rose to a shout, other times it sank to a weeping that turned the maid's blood cold. And always he kept his ledger, that terrible book of notes on Thomas's features, his supposed resemblance to Richard, his supposed betrayal of the Harrington bloodline. The ledger had grown so thick that its spine split, pages curling with ink-heavy scribbles. Edward's paranoia deepened to violence. He lashed out at servants for minor mistakes. Once, when Thomas spilled a glass of milk at the dinner table, Edward struck the boy so hard across the cheek that Catherine screamed. Edward's eyes were wide, almost gleeful, as he hissed, "You will learn who your father is." Catherine gathered the sobbing child in her arms, her own face pale with terror. She no longer saw her husband as a man, she saw him as a weapon, waiting to be unleashed. Catherine was torn between fear and longing. Edward's rage terrified her, his cold presence smothering her like a shroud. Yet Richard, with his reckless passion, frightened her too, for passion without caution could be just as deadly. She had chosen once before, in secret, when she had taken Richard into her arms while Edward was away. That choice had given her Thomas, and though she loved her child beyond measure, she now understood the weight of her sin. Every glance from Edward was punishment. Every smirk from Richard was a reminder. Some nights she considered running, packing only what she could carry, taking Thomas and vanishing into the countryside. But where could she go? She had no money of her own, no allies outside the Harrington name. Edward's reach extended through banks, courts, even the church. He would find her, and when he did, she feared not only for her own life but for Thomas's. And so she stayed, trapped in a gilded cage, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The collapse began on the night of the masquerade ball. It was February of 1918, and despite the scandal swirling around the Harringtons, Edward insisted on hosting the annual gathering. To cancel it would be to admit weakness, and Edward Harrington would never allow the town to see him falter. The great hall was filled with music and laughter, chandeliers blazing above masked faces. Catherine wore a gown of crimson silk, her mask lined with gold. Edward appeared in black, his mask sharp and angular, resembling a raven's beak. Richard arrived late, dressed in a soldier's uniform with no mask at all, as though daring the world to look him in the eye. The tension was palpable. Every guest knew the rumors. Every guest knew the whispers of paternity. And when Thomas appeared at the top of the staircase, dressed as a little page in velvet, the hall fell silent. The boy descended slowly, Catherine guiding him by the hand. But when his eyes found Richard, he broke free and ran across the hall, shouting with innocent joy, "Father!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Edward's face turned white behind his mask. Richard knelt to scoop the boy into his arms, spinning him once in the air before setting him down with a grin. The music faltered. The whispers grew louder, and Edward, trembling with rage, stormed from the hall, his mask falling to the floor with a hollow clatter. The Harrington scandal was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. The duel. 3 nights later, Edward challenged Richard to a duel. Dueling was long outlawed, but men of wealth and pride often clung to such traditions in secret. Edward sent the challenge in writing, his script jagged, as though carved into the page by rage alone. Richard accepted without hesitation. The duel was set at dawn in the frozen clearing beyond the estate's woods. Pistols, 10 paces, 1 shot each. Catherine begged them both to reconsider, falling to her knees in tears. But Edward only sneered, and Richard kissed her hand with mocking tenderness before leaving the room. At dawn the brothers faced one another in the snow. Their breaths rose in clouds, their pistols gleamed in the pale light. Catherine stood hidden among the trees, her heart pounding like a drum. The signal was given. They paced, they turned, shots rang out. Edward's bullet grazed Richard's shoulder. Richard's shot struck Edward's side, just below the ribs. Edward fell to his knees, clutching his wound. Richard advanced, lowering his pistol, his face a mask of triumph. But Edward did not die. He staggered to his feet, blood staining his shirt, and hissed through clenched teeth, "This is not finished. Not while he lives." He meant Thomas. Edward's wound was grave but not fatal. He returned to the estate, pale and weakened, but alive. Richard disappeared into town, boasting of his victory to anyone who would listen. The scandal, once whispered, now dominated every conversation. Catherine lived in constant fear. Edward's words echoed in her mind, "Not while he lives." She knew what he meant. She knew he had turned his fury, not only on Richard, but on Thomas. She scarcely let the boy out of her sight. At night, she barred the nursery door from within, sleeping beside Thomas in a chair, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand. Every creak of the house made her startle. Every gust of wind through the chimney made her heart race. Servants began to quit in greater numbers, unwilling to remain in a house that felt cursed. The halls grew quieter, emptier, the echo of footsteps carrying farther than ever before. It was in this silence that Catherine realized the Harrington estate was no longer a home. It was a tomb, and they were all waiting for the burial. In March of 1918, Edward made his move. Catherine awoke one night to find Thomas's bed empty. Panic seized her. She tore through the house, her cries echoing in the dark. At last, she found Edward in his study, the boy standing beside him, pale and frightened. Edward held his ledger open, pointing to a page filled with notes and sketches. His voice was low, cold, deliberate. "Look, Catherine," he said. "Look at the evidence. The boy is not mine. He is Richard's, and I will not raise another man's son beneath my roof." Catherine begged him to stop, falling to her knees, clutching Thomas to her chest. But Edward's eyes were dead. "Better no son at all," he whispered, "than to live with this shame." He reached for the pistol on his desk. At that moment, the study doors burst open. Richard stood there, pale from his wound but fierce as ever, a pistol in his hand. "Step away from them," Richard growled. For a moment, time stood still. Edward, Catherine, Richard and Thomas, the 4 pieces of this cursed puzzle, all frozen in the flickering lamplight. And then the gunfire began. What happened in that study became the stuff of legend, and no 2 accounts agree. Some said Richard shot Edward dead on the spot. Others claimed Edward turned the pistol on himself. A few even whispered that Catherine pulled the trigger, desperate to save her son. What is known as this? By dawn, Edward Harrington was dead. Richard fled the estate, never to be seen again, and Catherine remained, weeping over her child, the walls of the estate echoing with the silence of ruin. The town spoke of it for years. Some claimed Thomas was cursed, doomed by the blood of two fathers. Others insisted Catherine poisoned both men with her betrayal. As for Thomas, he grew up a haunted figure. His legacy was not one of wealth or power, but of scandal, the boy who bore two fathers, and the shadow of a family destroyed.
The death of Edward Harrington left the estate shrouded in silence, more profound than the snow that covered its roof. The once proud house that had hosted grand dinners and glittering balls became a mausoleum of whispers and unanswered questions. No one outside the family truly knew what had happened in the study that night. Some believed Richard had killed his brother in a final act of defiance. Others swore Edward had turned the gun upon himself in despair. A few, darker still, whispered that Catherine had taken matters into her own hands, driven by desperation to protect her child. What remained undeniable was that Edward was gone, and the Harrington name, once revered, had become synonymous with ruin. Catherine wandered the halls in a haze of grief and fear. Though Edward had been cruel, though his suspicion had been unbearable, his death had left her more isolated than ever. Servants fled in droves, unable to bear the tension, unwilling to be connected to a family whose scandal had consumed the county. The few who stayed moved like shadows, speaking in hushed tones, their loyalty grounded more in pity than in duty. The estate, once filled with light and music, now echoed with emptiness. Thomas clung to her constantly, his wide eyes always searching hers, as though afraid she too might vanish if he looked away. She kissed his forehead at night, whispering that she would never leave him, though her own heart trembled with doubt. Richard had disappeared after that night. Some said he fled across the sea, joining mercenary regiments in foreign wars. Others believed he lingered in the countryside, hiding in plain sight, watching from afar. Catherine sometimes woke with the sense that he was near, a figure glimpsed at the edge of the woods, a shadow on the road that vanished when she looked twice. She wanted to believe he had left them, that his fire no longer threatened to consume her child, but she knew Richard too well. He was not the sort to surrender what he believed was his. Thomas was his blood, his son, and Catherine feared Richard would return one day to claim him. The townspeople never let the scandal rest. Children were warned not to wander near the Harrington grounds, lest they catch the curse of the boy with two fathers. Mothers crossed themselves when Catherine and Thomas passed them in the market. At church, they felt the weight of stares that would not relent. The reverend preached sermons on sin and consequence that seemed aimed directly at Catherine's pew. She endured it with her chin lifted high, but inside shame gnawed at her like a rat at the beams of a house. She had thought time might dull the whispers, but time only sharpened them into legend. The name Harrington became less a family name than a cautionary tale. Thomas grew in this atmosphere of suspicion and fear. By the time he was 7, he had learned not to ask about his father. He carried the memory of Edward's stern gaze, but he remembered too the warmth of Richard's arms. He asked once, when Catherine tucked him into bed, which man had truly given him life. Catherine could not answer. She smoothed his hair and told him that he was hers, and that was all that mattered. But the boy was not satisfied with such half-truths. He was sharp, observant, a child who noticed when others looked at him too long, when the servants exchanged glances, when strangers muttered his name with pity. He carried questions inside him like stones, questions too heavy for his young heart. As he grew older, Thomas began to bear the mark of both men. His jawline and dark eyes were Richard's, but his solemn, brooding silence recalled Edward. Townsfolk whispered that he was a walking ghost, the embodiment of the feud that had destroyed his family. He seldom smiled, and when he did, it unsettled those around him, for it seemed too much like Richard's grin. The boy became a symbol of the scandal itself, and no matter how Catherine tried to shield him, the whispers reached his ears. He would clench his fists and walk on, but each word cut him deeper. By the time he was 12, the estate had decayed around him. Rooms were closed off, furniture covered in sheets, gardens left to grow wild. Catherine sold heirlooms quietly to keep the family afloat, but each sale chipped away at the Harrington grandeur. The chandeliers no longer glittered, the mirrors cracked, and the once gleaming staircases were dulled by dust. Thomas roamed these halls like a prince in exile, heir to a kingdom of ghosts. He often wandered into his father's study, Edward's study, and opened the drawers, where the infamous ledger still rested. Catherine had begged him never to look, but curiosity proved stronger. He turned the pages, and saw himself dissected in ink. Notes on his nose, his eyes, his hair. He read the words, "Not mine," written over and over, each stroke heavier than the last. That night, Thomas cried for hours, but he never let his mother see his tears. The ledger became an obsession. He returned to it again and again, studying the sketches, the comparisons, the notes of resemblance to Richard. The book told him what Catherine would not, that his true father was the man who had vanished, the man whose shadow still lingered in the stories whispered about town. Thomas began to dream of Richard, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a monster. In one dream, Richard took him by the hand and led him into a battlefield of fire. In another, Richard stood in the nursery, his face covered in blood, whispering, "You are mine." By the time Thomas was 16, the boy was gone. In his place stood a young man determined to uncover the truth. Catherine begged him to let the past die, to focus on his future, but Thomas was relentless. He questioned old servants, he searched the estate's hidden corners, he even spoke to townsfolk who still remembered the duel. He pieced together fragments of stories, each more troubling than the last. One night, in the market, a drunkard muttered that Richard had not left at all, that he had been seen near the woods years after Edward's death. Another whispered that Catherine herself had pulled the trigger that killed Edward, not Richard. Thomas carried these rumors like wounds. The search consumed him. He began slipping out at night, wandering into the woods with a lantern, calling softly for Richard. He left notes tucked beneath stones, scrawled with desperate words, "If you are alive, find me, I am your son." Catherine discovered one of these notes and burned it in the hearth, her face twisted with fear. She told him Richard was gone forever, but Thomas only shook his head. "He is in me," he whispered. "I feel him." As the years passed, Catherine withered under the weight of her secret. Her beauty, once praised across the county, faded into a gaunt mask. She was still elegant, still composed, but the fire within her had dimmed. She lived only for Thomas, but she feared him too, feared what he might do if he ever uncovered the whole truth. Some nights she considered telling him everything, confessing the sin that had birthed him, but whenever she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat, strangled by terror. She could not bear for him to hate her. When Thomas turned 18, he vanished for the first time. Catherine woke one morning to find his bed empty, his window open. She searched the grounds in hysteria, fearing he had gone to join Richard, or worse, to find his grave. Hours later, he returned, his clothes muddy, his eyes blazing. He said nothing, only went to his room and locked the door. Catherine never learned where he had gone, but from that day on, she knew he had taken the first step away from her and toward the shadow of his father's. The scandal did not die with Edward. It lived on in Thomas, in his restless search for truth, in the way his presence unsettled everyone he met. People still whispered when he walked through town, still crossed themselves when they saw him pass. Some swore he carried a curse, that no son born of such betrayal could escape doom. Others whispered that he would bring about the Harrington downfall once and for all, and perhaps they were right. For though Thomas bore the name Harrington, he carried the blood of two men, one who had sought to destroy him, and one who had claimed him with reckless pride. And within him, the war between them had only just begun. Thomas entered adulthood like a man standing at the edge of a storm. The Harrington estate was still his home, but by the time he turned 21 it was a home in name only. The great halls echoed with emptiness, and Catherine's health had declined to the point that she rarely left her chamber. He was the master now, though the estate was more a ruin than a prize. The land was mortgaged, the staff reduced to a handful, and debts nipped at the edges of every decision. Yet the townspeople still looked upon him with a peculiar mixture of awe and suspicion, as if he were not quite of their world, as if he belonged to something darker. Thomas had grown tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that drew the eye. His gaze was sharp, his voice deep, and though he carried himself with Edward's cold poise, there was an undeniable flicker of Richard's intensity in the way he moved.
in the restless fire that burned in him. People said he was too handsome for his own good, but they said it with unease, as though beauty itself could turn poisonous when born of scandal. Women looked twice when he passed, but their mothers tugged them away, muttering warning. Fathers watched him with suspicion, fearful of the Harrington blood that clung to him like a curse. It was around this time that Thomas began to move more openly among the town. He attended markets, dined at taverns, and visited church with his mother. Though the Reverend's sermons had not grown kinder, he made efforts to speak with neighbors, to show them he was no monster, but whispers followed him wherever he went. Sometimes he caught a word, bastard, curse, two fathers, and each time, though his expression did not falter, the words burned into him like brand. He returned to the estate afterward, with his fists bloodied from striking tree trunks, as though by punishing the wood he could silence the voices. Despite the shadows of his name, Thomas could not ignore the pull of life beyond his mother's guarded walls. At 23, he met Eleanor Whitcomb, the daughter of a local landowner whose wealth and reputation had not yet been eroded by scandal. Eleanor was unlike anyone he had known, kind, curious, with a softness that seemed untouched by malice. Where others saw in Thomas only the echoes of Edward and Richard, Eleanor seemed to see him alone. They met at a church gathering, and though Catherine stiffened at her son's interest, Thomas pursued Eleanor with the determination of a man who had spent his life denied. Their courtship was slow, marked by stolen conversations at market stalls and brief walks in the countryside. Eleanor's family was cautious, but she defended him fiercely, insisting that the sins of the fathers should not define the son. Thomas for the first time began to imagine a future that was not shackled by scandal. He dreamed of restoring the estate, of raising children who would not carry the burden he bore. With Eleanor he laughed more easily, his shoulders eased, his heart light. Catherine saw this change with both relief and dread, for she feared that love once again would awaken the old curse. When Thomas asked Eleanor's father for her hand, the answer was not immediate. The elder Whitcomb stalled, citing debts and land negotiations, but in truth he feared the Harrington bloodline. Weeks passed before Eleanor herself confronted her father, demanding he not punish her for rumors she did not believe. At last, perhaps swayed by her determination, perhaps weary of her defiance, the elder Whitcomb relented. The engagement was announced quietly, without the fanfare that would once have accompanied such unions. Catherine tried to be pleased, but shadows haunted her. She saw in Eleanor what she had once been herself, young, hopeful, entranced by a man bound to ruin. She wanted desperately to warn her, to say that love with a Harrington came with blood and betrayal, but the words never left her lips. Instead, she smiled and congratulated her son, praying silently that the curse would break with him. For a time, it seemed possible. Thomas and Eleanor planned their future with care. He began to sell parcels of land to pay debts, determined to salvage what he could. They spoke of repairing the gardens, of hosting dinners to show the town that Harringtons could once again stand proud. Eleanor's laughter filled the estate, and even Catherine seemed brighter when she visited. But peace never lingers long in a family built upon secrets. The cracks began small. On one evening, as Thomas sat in the study, Eleanor asked casually about his father. She had heard many things, she said, and wished to know the truth from him. Thomas stiffened, the old rage rising in him. He told her Edward had been his father, but she noticed the hesitation, the way his jaw clenched around the words. She pressed further, asking about Richard, the uncle whose name lingered like a ghost. Thomas snapped, insisting that the matter was closed. Eleanor apologized, but a seed of doubt had been planted. The seed grew. Eleanor was not immune to whispers. Friends confided their unease. Servants muttered behind closed doors, and she began to hear the stories Thomas had tried to bury. A child of two fathers, a duel, a curse. She loved him, but she also feared him, for there was a darkness in his eyes she could not deny. At times, she thought she glimpsed Richard's fire in him, a reckless spark that frightened her. The turning point came one winter evening, when a visitor arrived unannounced. Thomas had been away inspecting land, and Catherine answered the door. Standing there, cloaked in snow, was a man she had not seen in over 2 decades. Richard. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, his once youthful face weathered by years of wandering, but his eyes had not changed, piercing, burning, alive with the same dangerous charm that had ensnared her so long ago. Catherine nearly fainted at the sight of him. her heart slamming in her chest. He stepped inside as though no time had passed, as though he had merely been gone a season. "I've come for my son," Richard said, his voice low but steady. Catherine begged him to leave, to spare Thomas from the turmoil his presence would cause. But Richard only smiled. He told her he had watched from afar all these years, waiting until the boy was a man. He claimed the world had called him many things: a soldier, a wanderer, a fugitive, but one truth remained. Thomas was his blood, and blood could not be denied. When Thomas returned and found Richard waiting in the study, the shock nearly brought him to his knees. For years he had dreamed of this moment, imagined it, in countless ways. Now here stood the man who had haunted his every thought. They stared at one another in silence, mirror and reflection, until Richard spoke. "You've carried my shadow long enough," he said. "It's time you knew the man behind it." The days that followed tore the estate apart. Catherine pleaded with Thomas to turn Richard away, but Thomas could not. He needed answers. Richard filled his ears with tales of youth, of love, of betrayal. He painted Edward as a cruel tyrant, Catherine as a woman caught in a cage, and himself as the only man who had ever loved freely. He told Thomas that he had his fire, his spirit, his destiny. Catherine countered with her own truths. Desperate to shield her son, she reminded him of Edward's loyalty, of the dangers Richard had always courted, but Thomas was torn between them. Each word from Richard stirring something deep inside him, each warning from Catherine sharpening his doubt. Eleanor watched this unfold with growing dread. She saw how Thomas changed when Richard was near, how his voice hardened, how his laughter grew edged with recklessness. She feared losing him, not to death, but to a legacy of destruction. One night, she begged him to send Richard away, to choose their life together over the shadows of the past. Thomas could not. It was then that Eleanor made a choice. Without telling Thomas, she sought Richard out, meeting him in the stables under cover of darkness. She pleaded with him to leave, to allow Thomas peace. Richard listened, his eyes gleaming with something she could not name. He promised he would consider it, but his smile told another story. Days later, Thomas found Eleanor pale and shaken, unwilling to speak of what had passed. He demanded to know, but she only urged him to choose his future, not his past. The tension between them grew unbearable. Catherine watched helplessly as her son stood at the crossroads, torn between love and blood, between the man who had raised him and the man who had begotten him. The estate seemed to tremble under the weight of these choices. Servants whispered that the old curse had returned, that history was repeating itself, and in the dead of night, Thomas wandered the halls, haunted by the same dreams that had plagued him as a child. Dreams of two fathers pulling him in opposite directions, of blood spilled on the nursery floor, of fire consuming everything. It was only a matter of time before the past demanded its final reckoning. The winter storm that rolled across the Harrington estate seemed less like weather and more like prophecy. Snow lashed the windows, the wind howled through the chimneys, and every tree on the ground swayed like an omen. Catherine felt the heaviness of it in her bones, the way her mother had once spoken of storms that carried death. She could not sleep, for she knew the threads of her family's story were drawing together, ready to tangle into ruin. Thomas had grown restless, pacing the halls as though chased by unseen figures. His engagement to Eleanor, once a source of hope, now strained beneath the weight of Richard's sudden return. He loved Eleanor with a devotion that startled even him, but he could not turn away from the father he had imagined all his life. Richard offered him fire, freedom, and pride. Eleanor offered him peace, love, and the chance to be more than the shadow of scandal. But Thomas was not at peace, and peace did not run in his blood. That night, the storm battered the estate as Thomas descended into the study, where he found Richard sitting with a glass of brandy, staring into the fire. The flicker of the flames painted his face in shifting shades, sometimes noble, sometimes cruel. Thomas stood in the doorway, silent, until Richard turned with a half-smile. "You walk like him," Richard said. "Edward always did. The world thought he carried himself like a gentleman, but to me it always looked like a man trying to convince himself of his worth." Thomas bristled. "You speak of him with contempt, yet you left me with his name." Richard leaned forward. "I left you with more than his name. You've always felt it, haven't you? That pull inside you, the restlessness, the fire that doesn't let you sleep. That is me. That is what you've carried all your life." "I carry my mother," Thomas replied sharply, "and her suffering." Richard chuckled, though there was no warmth in. You speak like a man who thinks love is enough. But tell me, did Edward's love save Catherine from me? Did it shield her from scandal? Did it keep the world from tearing at her? No, Thomas. Love is weak. Blood, fire, those are what endure. Catherine, who had been listening just beyond the door, pushed it open with trembling hands. Stop filling his head with poison, she said, her voice cracking with desperation. You speak of fire, Richard, but all you've ever done is burn those who come near you. For the first time that evening, Richard's expression softened. And yet, Catherine, you loved me once. You cannot deny it. He gestured to Thomas, is proof of it. Catherine's breath shuddered. I loved you, yes, but I paid for that love with a lifetime of ruin, and I will not see my son pay the same price. Thomas looked between them, torn so deeply, it felt as though his body might split in two. He had spent years yearning for this moment, yet the reality was unbearable. One parent begging him to turn away, another demanding he embrace his destiny. He felt Eleanor's voice in his ear, pleading with him to choose peace, and he felt Richard's fire in his blood, urging him to seize something greater. The storm outside raged harder, as if the world itself mirrored his turmoil. It was Eleanor who entered next, pale as the snow, her cloak dripping from the weather. She had braved the storm to reach the estate, unable to bear another night, wondering what Thomas would choose. When she stepped into the study, and saw Richard by the fire, You shouldn't be here, she whispered. Richard smiled, rising from his chair. And yet here I am. You must be Eleanor, pretty, delicate, just the sort of anchor a man like Thomas might cling to. But anchors keep men from moving, and he was not made to be Eleanor's hand trembled at her side. He was made to be kind, to be better than you. That's what he wants, even if you can't see it. The words struck Thomas like a blow. He wanted to be kind, to be better, but kindness seemed fragile in the face of Richard's fire. His chest felt tight, his heart torn raw. Catherine stepped between them, her voice shaking with fury. This ends tonight, Richard. If you care for him at all, you will leave. You will not poison him further. I beg you, do not make my son the battlefield for your pride. But Richard's pride was immovable. He must choose. That's what you fear, isn't it? That if he chooses freely, he will choose me. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm outside, and the fire's crackle. Then Thomas spoke. No, he said, his voice steady at last. I do not choose you, and I do not choose to be haunted by Edward either. I am not a man of two fathers. I am myself. The words, once spoken, seemed to echo through the room. Catherine sagged with relief, tears springing to her eyes. Eleanor's lips parted, trembling with hope, but Richard's face darkened, his pride wounded deeper than any blade could strike. You think you can cast me off so easily, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. I live in your blood. You cannot erase me. You cannot deny me. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. I will not deny you, but I will not be you. For a moment, Richard faltered, as though struck by the weight of his son's defiance, but the fire in him was too wild to be quelled. With a sudden movement, he seized the brandy glass and hurled it into the fire, where it shattered with a burst of flame. Then you are nothing, he snarled, neither Edward's son nor mine. You are a ghost, born of betrayal, destined for ruin. Eleanor cried out, rushing to Thomas's side, but Catherine faced Richard with the steel of a mother who had nothing left to lose. Leave, she said, her voice sharp as ice. Leave this house, this family, this name. You have done enough. Richard looked at her, and for a fleeting instant, sorrow crossed his face. Perhaps he remembered the girl she had been, the love they had once shared, but it vanished quickly, swallowed by pride. Without another word, he turned and stormed from the study, the door slamming behind him. The storm outside seemed to follow him into the night, and when morning came, he was gone from the estate. Some said he left the county altogether, vanishing into the world as suddenly as he had returned. Others whispered he had been swallowed by the storm itself, claimed by the curse he had carried all his life. But for Thomas, the battle was not so easily ended. Though Richard had gone, his shadow lingered. For weeks, Thomas wrestled with rage, sorrow and doubt. He paced the halls, stood for hours in the gardens, stared into the mirror, as if searching for which man stared back. Eleanor stayed at his side, patient and unyielding, reminding him with every touch, every word, that he was not doomed to repeat the past. Catherine, though frail, found a new strength in seeing her son defy the curse that had nearly destroyed her. In time, Thomas married Eleanor in a quiet ceremony, attended only by a few loyal friends. There was no grand celebration, no fanfare, but there was love, steady, enduring, the kind of love Catherine had once dreamed of, but never known. Thomas pledged himself not to Edward, nor Richard, nor even to the Harrington name, but to Eleanor and the life they would build together. Yet the story did not close with joy alone. On the eve of their first child's birth, Catherine passed away. She died with Eleanor's hand in hers, whispering that she had lived long enough to see the curse broken. Thomas buried her beneath the old oak tree, the one place she had always loved, and though grief carved deeply into him, he found solace in the thought that she had died with peace. When his child was born, a daughter with Eleanor's eyes and his own dark hair, Thomas held her in his arms, and swore aloud that she would never grow under the shadow he had carried. He would raise her not as a child of scandal, nor as proof of bloodlines, but simply as his daughter. The Harrington estate never regained its former grandeur. The halls remained scarred, the gardens half wild, the debts never fully paid, but within its walls grew something stronger than reputation or pride, a family bound not by secrets, but by choice. Still, in the town whispers endured. People muttered of the child born of two fathers, of curses and storms and shadows that never die. They told the tale in hushed tones, a warning or a fascination, depending on the listener. Some believed Thomas had truly broken the curse. Others said he had merely delayed it, that one day his bloodline would again be torn apart by fire and betrayal. Thomas himself did not argue with them. He lived quietly, working the land, raising his children, and loving Eleanor with a devotion that no scandal could shake. But in the stillness of some nights, when the wind howled against the windows and the fire flickered low, he thought of Richard. He wondered where his father had gone, if he still lived, if he ever regretted the path he had chosen. And in those moments, Thomas whispered to himself, not with fear but with certainty, "I am not you." And though the shadows of Edward and Richard would always linger, Thomas Harrington built a life beyond them, proving at last that blood may shape us, but it does not bind us. The scandal became legend, the legend became myth, and in time, the truth was known only within the hearts of those who had lived it. The world moved on, but the story remained, a reminder of love and betrayal, of fire and ruin, and of a child born of two fathers who refused to belong to either. And so the tale of Thomas Harrington closes, not with triumph, nor with ruin, but with a fragile peace, wrestled from the jaws of scandal. A child born of two fathers, one of fire, one of silence, chose neither destiny, and in doing so he rewrote the story that threatened to consume him. But still the whispers never died. Was the curse truly broken, or merely delayed for another generation? Was Richard's shadow banished by the storm, or does it still linger in blood and memory? What do you believe? Was Thomas ever free from the men who shaped him, or do the sins of our fathers always echo through us, no matter how far we run? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've been drawn into this haunting scandal of love, betrayal and legacy, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next chilling story from the forgotten corners of history. Until then, remember, sometimes the past does not die. It waits.